we're all glad to be here tonight, right? So, what I think we're trying to accomplish this evening is to make sure that we spend a little time as a council thinking about and understanding the issues that we will be talking about in more detail during our budget session. So this is a good time for us to all be asking questions and sharing information about what our issues and interests are going into the process at this point. And my hope was we would start by having the Finance Committee, Jim, frame where the Finance Committee is at the moment in terms of closing out our budget process for 2015. Is that a fair representation? Okay. So I'm going to turn it over to Jim if that's okay with everybody. I am going to, I would encourage us to try to end by 6:30. We can do a little bit of a time check then. But we have an interesting evening before us in terms of challenges with some protesters outside and all the other things that we have to do tonight. So I think if we can try to monitor our time and stick to 6:30, that'd be great. Jim.
Okay. So Jan is bringing this up. Can you pass the handouts while we bring it up?
I thought you said, can we pass the hat around?
It is a budget meeting.
Pass, yes, that's right.
I hope we're gonna start in the back of.
We're in dire
Yeah.
straits.
Permit fee to assemble, right? Well, so I'm going to jump into this, and I'm going to go pretty quick through some of the foundational pieces you all have already heard right now. I'll spend a little bit more time on them this evening for the benefit of the public. The main thing I want to say is that what you have here and what I'm about to go through is the Finance Committee recommendations plus a little bit. There's some pieces that came in from staff since Finance Committee met that are there, and there's a couple places where the Finance Committee didn't get enough time to really discuss that I've left sort of the whole menu of options in place, but I'll address those as we go through. So real quick, I like this slide because I think it is our recipe to our goal of a sustainable budget, and we have to have good work in all of these pieces in order to do it. And so I just want to emphasize that we're not there yet, and we have a lot of work to do and a lot of ovals still as we move ahead to really try and create a sustainable budget. Welcome. Re-emphasizing that between now and 2019, we come very close to a $3 million operating hole. It's about $7.25 a year, starting next year, that we have to find in efficiencies, cuts, or new revenue. Next slide. I want to re-emphasize where we are with sales tax because that's the place that has not recovered. And I do not think it will recover until state government comes back, and I don't think that that's happening in the short term. This is why economic development is so important for the city as we try to find new ways to grow our base, to try and recapture that money and more into the future. Next slide. Specifically, we can look at the red line here, which is general retail sales tax. As you can see, it has not bounced back to its pre-2008 numbers. And also construction revenue, it has some room for growth. So just to reemphasize, state government was picking that up for us, and we don't have it, and we need to find new ways to pay our bill. Next slide. I want to emphasize this slide because in the city of Olympia, like every other business or every other government entity, our employees are our biggest resource. And as we think about what implications are of financial decisions, I just want to remind everybody that we're down this far and we haven't cut a lot of services. And so we're doing a lot of the same thing with less people, which means every conversation we have has the implication of making our ability to turn out good products suffer, because we don't have enough people to do what we're doing now. I think the staff are doing the best they can, but we as a council need to realize where we are staff-wise and in our programming as we make decisions moving forward. Next slide. So this is where the Finance Committee started its conversation. I'll outline this a little bit. Additional property taxes that we're anticipating that were not in the draft budget of 82,000 and some change. Additional utility tax funds that were not in the draft budget of 115. The Finance Committee spent some time talking about the B&O tax revenue and took really a conservative estimate on what we wanted to put in the budget for 2015. There has definitely been some forecasting that's higher than this 250 number, but we're confident that that's a safe number for right now, that we won't get us into trouble later in the year. We've also brought in the remaining council goal money from 2014 so that we don't forget about it, because if we forget about it, we lose it, or it ends up being part of our year-end savings.
Thanks, Mary.
And then lastly, the unallocated reserve of 142,000, which is, and I want to make sure I emphasize that these last two lines are not new money. So these are money we had, it's just directing it into the 2015 budget, including the unallocated reserve, which most of you will remember from 2011 year-end savings. We had about $200,000 that we've been allocating out of for the CRA process. That's the remaining amount, for a total of $632,949 in ability for new expenditures in the 2015 budget. So this balances that. The Finance Committee had a lot of discussion about how to move forward. There's a couple of things in here that come out of, and at the end of this talk, I'll pass out letters that we got from the mayor and from the Mayor Pro Tem with some budget priorities that they had, that they provided to the Finance Committee in advance. But so some of the things that you see here come out of those letters. And so just walking down, the $80,000 for police support staff, the youth employment partnership, which was Councilmember Rowe's idea. You'll see in the mayor's letter that he takes it down a little bit different track to think about parks maintenance. Finance Committee agrees that we should have some money set aside, but that there's some work to do to scope and figure out what that project and program really looks like. Parks maintenance, so what we've done here is consolidated all of the unfunded parks maintenance needs, including the artesian well request. Left to be done here is to know what amount of that money would actually be programming for the artesian well, because the Finance Committee wanted to separate out the programming, but not separate out any maintenance for a specific park separately. Do we know that yet, Paul?
Well, I think, let me ask you another question. So part of the discussion that we're about to have with land use is what are the council's expectations about outcomes for the park? And until we get there, I don't think we can give you a good number for programming, because I think we've all been asking ourselves, what do we expect to happen at the Artesian Commons as a final outcome? And how do we get there through programming, through maintenance staff, and through physical changes? So I don't think we know the answer to those questions.
So that could be something that comes out of maintenance or comes from council goal money in the future to fund programming at the Artesian Commons. We talked about the law enforcement acronym.
Records management.
Records management system. Regional management.
No.
Records, law enforcement, records management system. As you may remember, that number was 53,500 when we got the first budget. The police department has been able to absorb about 40,000 of that cost, with this being the remaining expenditure to get us. This is a regional system for Mayor Pro Tem Jones. The hazard trees, we put in $10,000 for a regional community corrections study, of which there's a draft scope of work coming around to you now. This is a project, actually a side conversation that Councilmember Selby and I have been having with electeds at the county about how can we do, at least study the opportunities for community corrections in our county, and how can we possibly do it on a regional basis. The scope of work that you see is two pieces. The first one being looking at community corrections, the second part looking at jail services. my opinion, and I agree with Steve's opinion, that as we progress with what this final scope of work will actually be and we decide on a contract, it's really good to focus on phase one now while we build trust to discuss whether phase two is a path that we want to go down. I'm gonna keep moving, but we'll have time for questions when we get through this. The next piece is what I'm calling an urban renewal program, and that is the economic development corridor that was proposed at $125,000. It's the 142 that we moved from unallocated reserve, which is the CERT work plan implementation, which includes J. Rich, the NDC, Eco Northwest, and when funds are identified, would include downtown planning. Personally, my recommendation to finance, and we didn't get into this, but is that we talk about that possibly being a executive level program. Maybe that's the Department of Housing and Urban Renewal, and we move 108 and CDBG all into one place, and where it lives and how that looks and feels is a conversation that the council can and probably will have at retreat. But just a place to emphasize urban renewal and economic development in our budget. And then that remains about $42,449 that's unspent, that we call council goal and opportunity money for 2015, but could be part of year-end savings when we look at that whole picture and how much money we have, probably around March 1st of 2015. Next slide. So these came from staff. They're really reality-based numbers. So some addition, we had in the preliminary budget the income for Fire District 3 service assessment, but we didn't have the expense, so that's being programmed. And we have a quarter FTE reduction inventory control specialist in the public works fleet. And my understanding is that has been backfilled by funding from the fire department fleet, so that person's not experiencing a reduction. It's just actually due to lack of work. Next slide. And so the Finance Committee went a little bit further. We looked at the description of the parking services account and what's remaining, and we recommend spending $460,000 of the parking services $630,000 balance, which the bulk of that, minus the last two things, so everything you see there down to pay by phone, actually is pulled right out of a very short presentation that the Finance Committee had from Parking Services of what they would like to do in 2015 that was not in the preliminary budget. It still needs some discussion and some vetting. This is one place where I did pull more than the Finance Committee talked about. The recommendations that were there, I realized when I was typing this out, is that the Finance Committee had arbitrarily prioritized Parking Services work plan without discussing them. And so I went ahead and put all of those things in this recommendation for the full council. In my opinion, I think they should either be in there as a whole or out as a whole and have a conversation if we decide not to fund them today. And then the last two items being the Downtown Police Patrol and the storefront partnerships, which we had a handout on our desk last week about. Both of those are probably ongoing costs that could continue to come out of the parking services account. Though I think the storefront partnership right now is probably best framed as a pilot. And then you can see the note that staff recommend that we don't go below $100,000 annually to cover costs of meter replacement, striping, and signage that comes up. Next slide.
So, just a second, we could go back to that. So this is the parking fund balance that currently exists, or one that's projected?
This is the what will be the current balance at the end of 2014. But this is what the expected transfer. No, once the year-end transfer happens, this will be the balance.
Correct. Okay.
Yep. Next slide. So some CFP adjustments that came from staff. Removal of the community park feasibility study. As you know, we moved that up and spent that money this year. Some adjustments to the transportation impact fees. Let's see, I just want to make sure I'm on the note that I need to say about that one. No, and then lastly, the big one being the public works adjustment. And when Public Works sat down with the Utility Advisory Committee, it was very clear that there was too many projects in the drinking water utility for 2015, and if we were gonna accomplish them, we would have to raise the rates higher than were in the preliminary budget. So they went ahead and recommended backing some projects out and pushing them out into the out years. Next slide. Oh, go back one, please, because I want to just make sure I say the note at the bottom, which is that that the finance committee did reaffirm the recommendation that we leave the cable TV tax in the CFP for building repair and maintenance. Next slide. So that leaves this list of unfunded priorities totaling 1.755 million. This is the whole list that we had seen, plus 4 additions that came through the process from different council members. Ability to get us up to 100% green power, which is number 3 on that list, which had been roughly calculated at 40,000. I hear there's a possibility that we could get a significant savings in year 1, but I'm gonna park that and see where questions go. Number 5, which was permanent supportive housing investment. There's a lot of conversations going on at different jurisdictions in the community about a county-wide permanent supportive housing project and what that might look like. So we begin to park a little bit of money in that conversation, but again, unfunded. The next one is Harbor Patrol. We heard a lot about that at the public hearing, so have a placeholder in here for unfunded. In talking with Chief Roberts at Finance Committee, there's a lot of conversation the council needs to have about what are the outcomes of that program and what is it providing for this community, and think about recommendations for next steps before we would fund something like this, but just want to park it. And then lastly, the number 11, which is the per capita for the arts. Inserted that at the last minute last night. Haven't talked to anybody about it, but that's a place we aren't projecting in 2015. It's also a place that we have not funded since 2009-ish. So that line, if we really wanted to think about it, in the whole picture, would also have a catch-up amount, but I haven't gone there yet. So looking at this unfunded priority list, my ranking you see on the left, and I did that on purpose because I'd like to ask the whole council to go through this exercise of ranking these 16 projects, 1 through 16, between now and the end of the year, and getting that information to Jane so the finance committee can take it up when we do year-end savings. I think it would be really, really helpful. As well, if there's things that come up between now and then that aren't on there, it would be great to get them added before the committee picks it up. The last note on this slide is up through line 11, the total is $1,055,000. So in at least looking at the historical outcomes of year-end savings, in most good years, we end up with about $1 million, give or take. And so I have a pretty strong confidence that we'll be able to fund a lot of the upper piece of this list when we get to year-end. But we don't know, so I want to make sure I park that because Jane will be mad if I spend it all now. Next slide, please. Wow, that was
And that reminds me of the 60s.
That was the rainy day fund.
She said, and she added transitions, and I didn't even know what that meant, so. So these are, of this budget process, some outcomes that are remaining, really priorities that we're calling out as a committee for 2015. Looking at what our rainy day situation is, how are we adequately funding parks, transportation, and our operating gaps into the future. Looking, in this one, at indirect cost study and technology 3-year plan, including police cam analysis. This is one where the finance committee, I think, has been pretty firm that we would like to see some movement on what the implications are of indirect cost sharing and what a 3-year technology plan might look like before we recommend funding the technology capital funds that are unfunded this year. We're pretty firm about that. The correction study is here because while we may put a little bit of money in, there's still a lot of work to get a final scope of work. Looking at all major revenue categories and making sure that we are getting the right revenue in the right places where appropriate. A lot of the recommendations from the capital facilities plan element from the planning commission, as well as other things that are in the letters from our advisory committees, which include the transportation impact calculations, a 1 versus 2 year CFP term, and then adding considerations for taxation language into the long-term financial strategy. And there's also about 6 work plan items from Councilmember Jones that are in his letter, which the committee is committed to looking at in the first quarter of next year with our priorities as well. So right now I'm passing around the letter from the mayor and from Mayor Pro Tem Jones that went largely, other than verbal comments, went into the creation of this product. Next slide. Actually, let's go back one. And so that's the recommendations of the finance committee. I'm going to say just a couple more things about the comments we've heard the most about, which is our parks and our voted utility tax. But I wanted to stop for a second and see if there's burning questions before I do that, and then we'll definitely be opening up the rest of the hour to discussion. Okay, I'm going to keep moving. Next slide. I counted to 5 before I did that. I'm proud of me.
Very fast.
And so, really, there's a couple slides here that I've pulled out of the staff slide presentations from the public hearing that I just want to demonstrate. I feel really clearly that this council wishes that we would have been able to keep buying as much land as possible, even through the economic downturn. And I also, actually, after the presentation we had earlier this year about loss of habitat, I think that this council is pretty clear that we have to fix something, and we need to make sure that there is adequate recreation space and adequate open space for this community into the future. What that means is yet to be determined in our parks fund. And I personally believe that we might want to think about pulling out a real and dedicated open space program within our inventory, but that's a future conversation. But I just want to highlight that in this last 10 years where we've made this expenditures, we've had the lost decade. We've almost lost a whole decade of growth. We're functioning now at pre-2007 revenue numbers and trying to do the same thing. We have made what I think are good decisions, given the cards that we were dealt, and in our ability to keep our parks open and keep all of them from closing, and also a very significant expense, which is that big yellow piece of the pie, to keep Percival Landing from falling in the water. And so while I know that there's a lot of opportunity going into the future, I personally feel like after a really thorough review, like there's no question that the council's done the right things and the best it could with the choices it had to make in the moment. And I would say, even go so far as to say that I don't think there's any group of individuals in this community that's more in touch with the voters than the people that have recently been elected by the voters. So I just want to make sure that I say that. Next slide, please. So this is how that voted utility tax, and you've seen this slide, is laid out in the current CFP. Next slide. And then really, this is the exciting and amazing work of our Parks Department in the last decade. And I think that all aside and all hopes and dreams for the future, which the Finance Committee has been directed by this council to dig into the voted utility tax and look at funding for park acquisition and maintenance and operations in the first quarter of 2015. And we're committed to sitting down with the former Councilmember Mesmer and Jim Lazar and the folks who wrote those assessments to really dig into how can we move forward in a way that gets the public happy and gets us in a place where we're all moving forward to figure out how to sustainably fund parks in the future. Because the problem is that no matter how much we move around what we have now, we don't have enough to do what we want and what we need to do with our aging infrastructure in the future. So that's the Finance Committee recommendations with a little bit of ad-libbing from me, and just double check and make sure there's nothing major from Jane or Steve. Give the meeting back to the mayor.
Okay, well,
20 minutes.
pretty good. So, what So what I'm gonna do is, as Jim mentioned earlier on, I want to talk briefly about some of the recommendations that I have that are not currently on the table for discussion. And I'm gonna pass around my memo, which also went to you guys electronically. Jim and I talked about it just before the meeting with Paul Simmons, our city manager, and Jane Kirkland. And it actually builds on, Jim, you want to go back, or Jane, could you go back 2 slides? I think, yeah, that's a good one. Okay, so first thing that I want to reinforce, which is reinforced in my paragraph here, I thank you, Finance Committee. I think I appreciate the Finance Committee taking into consideration the issues I brought forward and the Finance Committee meeting a couple of meetings ago. And thank you for the work that you did in preparing us for tonight's discussion. I think it's extremely helpful, and I think it actually goes a long ways to really getting policy control over the budget. So I think that's really good. I also want to emphasize some of the points that Jim just made in terms of the voting utility tax. My own interest at this point is I want to put on the table what I think is the sentiment of this council, which is we are interested in parks acquisition. We are interested in a discussion that is moving forward, and I think all of us have expressed some frustration in not having been able to participate in past decisions around the Parks Fund. So what I'm proposing here is to adjust our CFP to create a park acquisition account and take into consideration what I think has been good comment from our public. Focus in on the good messaging in terms of this is a community that does want to move forward and does want to invest in a parks plan that helps prioritize how we invest in parks into the future. And I think that we should do that by creating a parks acquisition account in our capital facilities plan. And my own recommendation, as you can see here, is creating an account, a parks acquisition account in 2015 that is somewhere between $300,000 and $1 million. And I think in discussions with staff that this is something that is achievable and that we can do. I also want to make sure that we do move forward in a deliberate way to consider the Olympia Planning Commission's recommendations about a Metro Parks District. That could be another way for us to get on a path that is very deliberate in terms of investment in parks. I understand that that PrAC is investing time and effort into that. I just wanted to highlight it here as one of the overt strategies that the council can acknowledge as a meaningful potential path forward. I also wanted to put on the table a much more deliberate effort than has been being taken to date from my perspective on the Ward Lake property, where I think that that's a good representation of our regretting a move that was taken in haste, and I think it's of value to revisit that particular property, which was, which I think from our council's discussion, it's really way too costly to develop as a swim park, which was the intent when purchased. And I think this is an issue for the council council to weigh in on and think about and consider. And those are resources that have a potential for reallocation to things that are reflected in both our comprehensive plan and in our parks plan. So I want to take us next to the LBA Woods issue. I think that one of the things that is really important to acknowledge is that we clearly have a stakeholder group in this community. It's actually a broad stakeholder group that is interested in preserving LBA Woods. What isn't as clear is exactly what we would do if it was purchased. And there's a lot of competing interests at work here. And I think at this juncture, it is important for us to acknowledge what we have heard. But it's also, I think, important for us to outline the things that we need some help on in terms of figuring out how to handle. And they range here in the bullets that I put in the letter. But I think that this is where we really could partner with our public to think clearly about what we want to achieve with an LPA purchase. And it is, I think, worth looking at different options or approaches. Everything from the beginning of what I outlined as potential for creating a local improvement district that is geographically appropriate for the community to put funds together to buy LBA woods. That's much more for local use. I think we need to look at a range of other options, which I won't read here. They're in the list. One of the foremost, though, is a larger consideration of if LBA extension is not going to be built, we have to acknowledge that log cabin. Excuse me. Thank you. Just test if you're listening. Could rename that project. If log cabin extension is not built, that means a whole other range of impacts on Boulevard Road and Morris Merriman Road in terms of having to buy right away, having to consider how we meet our regional transportation plans needs. We just need to look at the trade-offs there. So what I'm hoping is that we can send a clear message that we want to work with our LPA with stakeholders in terms of talking about different options. But I think that there's a range of things that do need to be considered before we just simply move forward to that. Last but not least, I think that I promised a draft letter in response to the advisory committee letters that we've received. I want to emphasize that the comments here are not that response, which I will continue to work on. There are three things, though, from the Planning Commission letter that I think do have impact and are important to consider in our 2015 budget deliberations. One has to do with the maintenance funding. And this is already in the Finance Committee's recommendation. But I think we need to move forward deliberately with consideration of an indirect rate proposal. I want that done as quickly as possible. And I think that needs to include a council work session. Second, the condition assessment major maintenance program, the CANT program. This is a program that has been done all the time that I've been on council. And I'm fine with funding CAMP again, but I think we need to, at this point, have very clear monthly reports and some kind of performance management assessment of what's working and what's not working with CAMP. Last but not least, one of the things that's been emphasized in a number of our advisory committees that is in our current comprehensive plans as well as our future comprehensive plan is the importance of, and was emphasized in the Planning Commission's letter to us, was to create a connected and coherent network of bicycle facilities. I think that this should be a priority in a transportation plan. And I think that we should be working towards a program that that helps us meet that objective and that vision. We need a much more coherent plan. We've sort of started that work, but it hasn't gelled yet in specific investments. And I think we have an opportunity to, again, specifically call that out as a priority with the expectation that it be included in our transportation plan. So those are the things that, again, in reflecting back on our public hearings, in reflecting back on what our citizens have said to us, I think that these few things, probably the most substantive of which is creating the park acquisition account and the CFP, that I would recommend we include in our 2015 budget. So at this point, I'm happy to answer questions, and I think we can open it up for discussion as well.
So this parks acquisition account will be new,
Mm-hmm.
so where's the money gonna come?
Well, so we have, there's a menu of programs. I think that's the easiest that we have identified in short order is the moving $230,000 from the Grass Lakes project that's in our capital facilities plan, and adding in $100,000 of the real estate excise tax money in a way that would free up other operating money in the parks budget to go into an parks acquisition account. That doesn't get me quite as far along as I want to go. However, I do recognize that once we do have an acquisition account in the CFP, gives us an opportunity to add to it. And I think that we can set a goal to continue to add to it. And that can be a part of the capital facility, or that can be part of the finance committee's work in looking at the capital facilities plan and the parks issues as part of next year's work. But I want to make sure that I'm hoping that we can start this process now in the 2015 account, and we can take those two fund sources and create a parks acquisition account, which gets us started down this path.
So this is our last year to be able to do that with the REIT, right?
Potentially, depends on legislative action if it's going to go further. If it depends on whether or not what the legislature does. I mean, they could continue that, or they could not continue that. I suspect that, and actually, I mean, this is an expression. This is one-time money. And in some respects, I think this is it's also some of our most flexible money, but it gives us the ability to move money around and create a flexible position. So the short answer is yes, potentially it's the last one.
So if we redirect REIT 100K of that to this acquisition fund, what doesn't get funded that was REIT is funding now?
All of REIT goes into the transportation budget, so it is a reduction in our pavement management, which it does leave, I would estimate, somewhere around $850,000 to $900,000 in the transportation budget for pavement management.
The total budget's more than that, that would be the amount remaining from REIT.
Oh, excuse me, and that's what I meant to say, is it's the REIT portion, or the REIT contribution to pavement management. But what, in the larger perspective of things, I think $100,000 out of the pavement management account, which is a total of pavement management.
approximately
Roughly.
2 million a year.
Yeah, so, it's not a huge hit, and I think, and I actually, in terms of the new approach to pavement management, I'm hopefully to get more mileage out of that. I don't see any huge potholes in this direction.
Okay. One more remark, just thank you very much, because the whole parks acquisition debate is one that's in front of our minds and in our inboxes daily. And by addressing this, you know, that it is on our minds, and how could it not be? And to have those folks in our council chambers, you know, week after week, being very gracious, but very strong in what they want, and having, you know, a petition signed by 5,200 of our constituents, and pretty broad-based as well. So I appreciate you at least saying, we're gonna look at this, and with some other options for, you know, future discussions. So going forward, this acquisition pot of money, shouldn't it be funded from the voted utility tax?
And I think that's a great question. That's why I have the slide up here. I think we have some challenges in terms of changing how we do this work. And this is not a perfect solution. I think that where we have landed here is defensible. The deal is, though, that I think that we need to represent that we are moving down a path towards more park acquisition. So I think it's late in the game to completely restructure what has been proposed. By creating an account in the capital facilities plan, however, that does give us an opportunity to continue down this path of adding money within the CFP for acquisition. I'm hoping that it will get us all on the same page together in terms of advocacy groups for parks, where we're looking at how we are going to spend this money, and how we are going to continue down a path of investment in parks, even in a constrained resource environment. And I think that it opens the door through the Finance Committee process to continue to look at different ways to direct funds into a park acquisition account. It's got to be the beginning of the process. It isn't the final fix to the process.
That debt service retires in 17?
Basically, yes, the end
yeah.
of 16, our last payment's the end of 16.
Yeah, and that's an important thing to keep in front of us. So and for me, that's the reason why we really need to get people on the same team that want the same result, which is really thoughtful investments in park acquisition. We need a parks plan, and we need people to be working together in terms of prioritizing what our investments are going to be, so that in 2017, when we have an opportunity to flip that bond, we are able to move quickly towards the goals that are established in the parks plan. So I don't think that should be the end of the story in terms of park acquisition. I think what I hope is that it will get people, instead of looking backward, get people looking forward, saying, what are we going to invest in? What are the best choices?
Is that gonna be part of the Parks Plan update? Okay, so it's good time. Yeah. I have a question.
Yes, please.
With regard to the road maintenance, I thought that we just recently had a presentation by Rich, how far behind we are. And so, you were proposing taking 100,000 out, and you said you hoped that due to our new way of, what did you mean by that? Our new way that the money would go further, is that what you said?
So,
I wasn't clear about what you meant.
What we requested was that Public Works really evaluate what their methodology and approach was to pavement management. And Rich, do you want to say anything more? I mean,
Well,
I don't have to put you on the spot here, but
Sure, I guess just very briefly, we did a breakdown of the pavement ratings by classification of streets. In the past, the council's been given pavement ratings for the entire system. We broke it down by classification of streets, from neighborhood type streets to collector and arterial streets. We also looked at the pavement condition of streets in the downtown. And so, overall, there's not a high degree of variability currently between the types of streets. The arterial and collector streets are slightly better. What really jumps out is the poor condition of our downtown streets. And so what we suggested is that we allocate more funding to try and improve our downtown streets. It's linked to council's economic development goals for downtown. That would, because there's not any more money that we're adding to the pot, however, that would need to come at the expense of something else. So we would see over time some slippage within the neighborhood residential streets, or perhaps a good condition to fair in some cases. But that's a worthy trade-off we felt in order to put more money into our downtown. That's the crux of the presentation, and one that we plan to go into in more detail with the full council sometime early next year.
So.
The finance saw direct, the quick version of that.
Oh, you did. So the reduction or deduction of 100,000 isn't that?
What it would mean is that we would potentially scale back what we're planning to do in the downtown, or we would be scaling back what we're doing on our arterial and collector streets. That would really be a call that we need to get direction from the council, but it would be 100,000 less dollars that we have to fund pavement maintenance.
Right. So I think there's more to come in terms of our discussion about how we do this, but it's the right question. So, Councilmember Williams.
Thank you. So I really agree with the exploring the sale of the Ward Lake property. It's kind of a big green element, I guess, around our neck. And it really doesn't contribute really to open space that I think is valued by the community. It's not really, having Steve Hall and I having jumped over and both fallen off the fence going in to look at it, and going down to where the swimming beach should be located. It's just not suited for the intent that it was purchased for, which is really unfortunate. But hopefully we'll be able to sell it to some multi-millionaire who doesn't care about how much we pay for it. Gives us way more money than what it's worth.
Density over there.
And that we put that back into this, into the funding for parks, actually, as much as possible. The other thing that I think is that bicycle facilities are really a transportation issue, and actually, bicycle facilities also have particular pavement needs that are higher than the needs for cars. And so I really see, I hope for a much tighter integration of the connected and coherent network of bicycle facilities, it sounds so nice, as a priority in the transportation plan, and that we really need to consider how we want to do that tightly integrated with pavement management, because I see that we're going to be doing a lot of sharing of pavement, that would be where there'll be more of a bicycle focus, but it will be on less traveled, side streets and so on, but that we really need to maintain at a higher level than we would be planning if we focus on downtown, which I support. That said, I also think that what we ought to do is come up with a plan for improving road condition downtown, so that we bring it up to a certain standard, and then once we've achieved that, then to reintegrate the whole street network into this, once we have accomplished what we're looking for. So I think we need to be really specific about how we'll know that we're at where we want to be at in terms of downtown street condition. And then once we've achieved that, then to relook at how we're allocating the money and make sure that we have something, sort of a placeholder for that in the budget, going down the road. Obviously, it won't be this coming year, but still, I think we need to make a note of that and say, this is what we intend to do, bring it up to the standard we intend, and then reshift the money once it's up to the standard that we expect in the downtown area and citywide. Because right now it's below city standard, below the rest of the city standard.
So,
Can I ask a follow-up?
yeah, please.
To the Ward Lake acquisition, is that to how much, or reacquisition, or selling?
Disposition.
Disposition. What did we buy that for?
Can I actually just suggest that this is a very complex financing conversation to talk about Ward Lake? Like, because there's so many funding sources that are grant funded and state funded. That it doesn't matter how much we bought it for, we have to figure out how to pay everybody back.
Well,
About
how much?
About 3.5 million.
Thanks, that's all I wanted to know.
I'm just trying to keep us
Although-
back to the point.
No, and thanks
Although I
for saying that,
have-
because, that's why I was pretty deliberate about how I worded it, meaning that, I don't know what we'll end up with it.
Well-
Hopefully, we won't end up with a loss, but I hope that whatever remaining funds there are go into, any remaining funds would go into the parks acquisition.
Well, I think any funds have to go into parks acquisition.
I really like this, and part of the reason is because I think it gives us the opportunity to bring our community together, and to show that, yes, we're hearing what you're saying, but we also understand that there are a lot of questions that need to be answered, and you get to be part of finding those answers.